Do you immediately know what GDS and OTE stand for? Chances are you have been working in the travel industry. For those of you who don't know, it's an industry with very complex payment structures. This is a massive opportunity for new embedded finance products, but likely only players who understand how the industry works can succeed. In this episode, I speak with Eric-Jan Krausch. Eric is a founder of 1CP, a corporate payment solution. With 1CP, but also with his previous business AKA Modio, Eric focuses on the travel industry, providing him unique insights. In this episode, we speak about how payments work in the travel industry, why B2B is so much bigger than B2C, and what new trends are evolving in the industry. My name is Lars Markl, and this is the Embedded Finance Review podcast. Every 2 weeks, I'm interviewing the builders and shapers of embedded finance. And now let's dive in.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. Happy to have a conversation today about travel and payments.
Yeah, perfect. You mentioned already travel and payments. This is the world we're going to dive in this podcast, looking at the different, let's call them embedded finance / fintech / financial service use cases in the travel industry. And when using the term travel industry, spoke about that pre-chat as well. It's not everybody in the listeners knows everything about this industry and maybe exactly what it determines or how is it defined. So maybe you can help us a little bit. When I or you say travel industry, what do you exactly mean?
I think travel always consists the full value chain, right? So I think from the products that everybody knows, whether it's train flights, accommodation, it's also consisting the services around it. It's also consisting the suppliers that are needed to have that services to be used. But also it's using all of the distribution chain that is more towards the customer, like intermediaries, online travel agencies, web shops, but could be also local stores still. There is still a lot of business happening on travel management companies which are on ground side. So I think for me, travel is actually everything around these topics, from the known suppliers, but also the supply and distribution network around it.
And maybe obviously like high level, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe it makes sense also to dive a little bit deeper into the different type of providers that are in the value chain. I guess from either consumer or maybe even business travel booking perspective, we all know like a booking.com and these kind of platforms. But high level, maybe you can tell us a little bit like what kind of players are active. And also looking at the payments and embedded finance discussions afterwards, but maybe like high level, what kind of like group of companies are relevant and what is their specific role?
Maybe let's pick one category, accommodation, where I think within the hotel space itself, right? You have the operator for the hotel. They might have suppliers like cleaning services or certain supporting companies in their day-to-day operations. So we already have certain payment flows that are, for example, payroll, that are, for example, supplier payments within the hotel. But when you have the hotel being to be sold into the corporate, into the traveler, you have different kind of intermediaries usually. So there is the possibility for the hotel to do sales on their own homepage. Let's call this one the direct channel. What you can find on their own homepage, they have their own online booking engine where you are using certain software companies. Some hotel chains build their own booking engine, but usually you have an existing provider providing you with this piece of online booking engine where you can choose the room and you do the checkout yourself.
Got it.
I think we see a trend towards these direct channels because there is lots of meta search engines, also Google Maps, for example, which are now driving business directly to these direct channels. But for a hotel, they don't really have the ability to have all of their availabilities to be filled just by their own direct channel. So there's also the other indirect channels, and they can be usually managed through something called a channel management system. So you try to have an aggregator who's helping you to have your products spread across the web, and they help to route this through to different kind of intermediaries. So there could be, for example, an OTA, online travel agency, which is Booking.com, Expedia, where you are just providing your rates and availabilities to, and they have their own marketing, their own lead generation and mechanics in the background, where the supplier pays a commission to have its own availabilities sold towards the traveler. Also very important that the commission also is its own payment flow,
Obviously.
creating a little bit of headaches, let's put it like that. So there's also some online travel agencies who are acting as a pure broker. They are basically facilitating the purchase directly within the channel of the supplier. But we see a big trend now that the online travel agency gets its own financial licenses so that they can act as the merchant of record. So they are balancing directly with the client, and then they do payouts towards the supplier where they already carve out their own commission. So they basically just settle on the net in the background.
Lots of things I want to go into to understand. Obviously, high level, very simple. Of course, the hotel can do the direct listing on the website. That's pretty clear. And then you mentioned, of course, the indirect one. You mentioned there, obviously, the OTAs, like a company like Booking.com is maybe most well-known brand here among the audience. So obviously, a hotel could potentially manage that on their own, basically make sure that the listing is everything fine. Or you said also there are I think you call them channel management companies who basically help, because obviously it might not just be Booking.com, but there might be a lot more. So this is like a little bit like the tech enabler for a hotel to be listed on all relevant platforms.
Absolutely. There's also a little bit more legacy in the background. So channel managers is rather a new thing since 10, 15 years. There's also global distribution systems that you might know from brands like Sabre or Amadeus, which is already bundling a subset of suppliers from different categories like airlines, hotels, and others. And they usually already help in providing the ability to build an itinerary where you have the different products that usually come together for a trip,
Flight,
so that you can directly put them together. And there's a quite easy, simple method to find out whether you were booking through a GDS system, a global distribution system. The usual 6-digit number, the passenger name record that you know from flight tickets. This is a very unique thing coming from these GDS systems. And so the moment you see these popping up somewhere, you always really can be sure that there was a little bit more legacy system in between. But this is also different by the channels. You could have these different systems put along into the value chain. So you could have your hotel system going into something called central reservation system, which is a pre-organization. If you have, for example, multiple hotels, right, you want to have them together in one central system. From that central reservation system, you can push it through a channel manager. From the channel manager, you go through a GDS system, global distribution system. And then from the GDS system, you have a travel management company or an online travel agency consuming the product feed that was come along before. Between all of these steps that usually are hidden for the consumer, these intermediaries, they all have their own added value chain of, for example, using virtual cards to settle with each other. And in the worst case, you have multiple credit cards issued for the same transaction. And of course, they all consume their interchange for the step they were doing. And that makes it sometimes really interesting to see where actually the business model is left behind and where they're taking the margin from. And lots of travel intermediaries are now playing the game of issuing their own cards in exactly having an additional margin out of the same business.
There's obviously a lot of points, and also you mentioned the OTAs that are getting licensed by themselves is also a topic I want to come into. But maybe before, from my perspective, like finishing a little bit the structure of the travel industry. So let's say me as a consumer, or maybe even as a business person booking, very often I book through a company like Booking.com, or perhaps use the provider that my company offers or has asked me to book through, right? So at the end of it, you're saying all these different providers that are on the background. I mean, I don't specifically choose one or the other, right? I use Booking.com or maybe another company that helps me with booking. That just depends who they then rely on this kind of setup. Or put differently, if I use Booking.com, this could be this one route A going through a new modern channel management provider based on the hotel I've chosen, or could also be a complete different provider on the background, right?
Absolutely. And sometimes it's very complicated because some online channels consume multiple sources. And so they could have the same room, the same availability actually being shown with two different prices because they are coming through two different routes. Some do the optimization and choose what is best for the intermediary to go with to improve their margin if you have the same price, for example. But also some platforms are trying to be as transparent as possible to give that added value directly to the consumer. And I think these room mapping, for example, sometimes it works very well, sometimes it's not working well at all. And then you have multiple rooms in the same search and you think like, oh, what's happening here? Why is this so clunky? And usually it's because of the distribution value chain that is in between, which is not always very synchronized.
How's technology or maybe innovation in general being adopted like in the travel industry? And the reason I'm asking this is because from what I understood is you told me there are these channel management companies, something that has been come up in the last 10, 15 years. And it sounds more like, let's say, the modern approach. Previously on the podcast, we also had the founder of News here, obviously focused on hotels. So there is, I think, a lot of technology happening, but like how much is actually going through the modern rails already, and how much is still being processed over, let's say, old school routes? Quite keen to understand a bit more how innovation is being adopted in the industry.
I think travel was very innovative, and I think it was a few years ago that it actually turned into legacy. And I think this is a big problem because due to the high adoption of certain systems, which, for example, cover global supply chain of hotels, a global supply chain of airlines, right? It was already a huge success that they were able to standardize airline distribution to distribution for a worldwide market. So let's put this maybe up front. They had their golden times. I think the problematic part was that these legacy systems they were built upon never really made it into the web 2030 times. And I think this is what you see at the moment. The products itself have to innovate. So, for example, with airlines, the planning and orchestration of their own flight schedule now gets renewed with new systems. And this new data quality fuels new ideas for distribution because they can differently set up. There's something called NDC, new distribution capabilities coming up from airlines. It basically decouples the prepackaged product of a seat in an airline, which you only were able to buy one seat in economy, including baggage, including meals, including whatever, right? With NDC now, they are able to distribute every of these items individually so that the client basically could choose what he actually wants to consume. So I think the innovation happens more within certain ecosystems, whether it's inside the supplier, whether it's inside the distributor, whether it's inside the selling channel and organization. But what I think still is really left behind is the layers connecting all of them together. And of course, there's also a few people out there trying to solve this with any kind of blockchain technology to decentralize it. But I think there's one very important factor is that all of these entities are built upon trust to each other, right? If you want to purchase from Germany a hotel somewhere on the other side of the world, you want to be really sure that this is actually working. And this is currently, let's say, being paid on basis of the technology of these old legacy systems. They're still doing their job, right? The 6-letter PNR record thing is here since more than 40, 50 years. And it still is very clunky. It looks like, if you saw the evolution of Twitter, right? You started with only 60 signs or 160 signs, and then it got more and more and more and enriched and more data and pictures and live streams. And now with Grok AI in totally different spheres. Well, the PNR record still works with 60 signs caps lock. And let's say everybody around it was able to, let's say, reuse it for their own purpose. And it's misused in many, many ways. But it's still there, it's still working. And it's very important because a lot of systems are relying on it. So I think pushing innovation for these connecting layers is a very hard thing because it needs to be well thought, it needs to be very clear, structurized, and you need adoption, which is in the same reach as the legacy system you try to replace. And just with the airline example of NDC, new distribution capabilities, The airlines self-invented it, but I think all major airlines used it in a different way. Some are not supporting all functionalities. Some are just supporting certain functionalities. They were building their own on top of it. And that created a massive headache for every other distributor to consume all of these supply chain, because they basically had to individually connect to every supplier. And this was putting the added value of a centralized system at absurdum, because later now everybody's looking at a broken piece of technology and says, okay, but the old world still works, right? Why should I go to the new one? The added value is not really visible anymore if I have all of the efforts to connect to that.
Yeah, that sounds to me like, I don't know, let's say like an incredibly, and of course, again, the travel industry is very broad, and there might be areas where it's possible, but like high level, what you're describing right now is like, yes, it would be like an extremely like smart entrepreneur with a new idea doing something completely new and disruptive, so to say. It's a really hard space to do that, right? Because in a way it's very fragmented, it's a lot of dependency, what you mentioned. So in a way it's not maybe necessarily, as we usually say, like the best product, but it's maybe more about the distribution, the connection, and the partnership that matter a lot more.
And a lot of politics. Of course, all of the parts inside the value chain also try to protect their own business model, right? So let's say there is still a lot of companies who don't bring in a lot of added value anymore. They are just connectors and try to change data structure A to data structure B.
Yeah, but you can't get rid of them.
Of course. Yeah, and also suppliers, of course, know that they can manipulate the market, right? They can choose a new standard and only push the lowest rates through the new data standard they decided themselves. And then they can push some of these innovations themselves into the market. And as you said, it's not always the best product that wins kind of politics then.
And now let's zoom in a bit on the, or let's not a bit, a lot on the financial service pieces in the travel industry. Maybe intro question, like high level, the last 5 to 10 years, have you seen major changes when it came to like financial services in the travel industry, and what have you noticed?
I think one that I already mentioned is that there's a lot of new revenue streams currently tried by issuing credit cards and have the ability to get a certain revenue out of existing business by just having the interchange fees available as an issuer.
And just for clarity, can you maybe describe exactly how this exactly works? Like who's issuing the card, what kind of transaction?
So for example, we have a good example with Booking.com. They have Booking.com Pay. And usually, let's say up 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you went to Booking.com, they ask for your credit card, but actually the credit card was balanced directly by the merchant. By some technical magic and intermediaries, hopefully it ended up in the system of the merchant, which is always not the case. I think your interview with Matt from News was exactly going to that topic. This is still up to date, very, very clunky. Booking.com was only a broker. And now with Booking Pay, what they added is the layer that they get merchant of record. They are balancing against the customer's credit card.
So let's take an example. I book a hotel room for, let's say, for €100. In the old world, I would have given my details to Booking.com. They would have given it to the hotel, and the hotel XYZ would have taken $100 or €100 from my debit card. And now basically this transaction is not done by the hotel anymore. Now this transaction is basically being done by Booking through Booking Pay.
Exactly. And then they create a new virtual card, which then is issued towards the hotel. So they do the balancing on the virtual card. And there is, let's say, 2 major changes on that operations. Booking can already collect its commission when the actual booking is happening. Before, it was an after process where they were balancing afterwards, right? And now also it definitely changed the operations on the supplier side, because they are just accepting a certain amount, which is already deducted by the commission, right? And I think there's a little bit of gold mining feeling in the industry for virtual cards, because everybody who have to pay suppliers, the card issuers try to bring them the product of virtual cards. Because, of course, with the interchange fee for commercial cards, it's uncapped in Europe. With private cards, you have a 0.6% cap. With commercial cards, you don't. And these collection of these interchange cards, the majority of that fees is for the issuer of the card. And of course, this is a little bit of the interesting part for everyone trying to issue virtual cards along the value chain of travel, because this, of course, creates new revenue sources based off existing business, but also helps for cash liquidity and treasury reasons, of course, where you can already tap into the cash flow much earlier than you would be without such mechanisms. And in regards to other innovations,
maybe just one follow-up, before we go to the other areas, just a follow-up question. I mean, I guess I know the answer, but just like we described the example of now okay, I book my bills through the new version with Booking Pay. They take from my debit card immediately the €100. Now, obviously, I guess you mentioned that it's not just a Booking Pay example. It might be in a lot of areas in the travel industry where payments, B2B payments, have to happen, in this case between the company booking and the hotel. And this is now happens through a new virtual card being issued. So, of course, the first question that somebody from the outside would ask, okay, why using cards at all, right? Like, why not use transfers, invoices, all the other things? So maybe can you describe a little bit why are cards so important and crucial for these transactions, where in other industry we probably wouldn't really see cards being used in that one?
Absolutely. I think, as I said, the distribution layer is still a little bit legacy, and the trust mechanism also was built on the trust of card schemes. So when you look into the early field namings of GDS systems, for example, there was no real place for a payment option. It was more a card number field. It was expected you're doing travel, it needs to be paid on card. It's also very interesting if you look into the card range the number ranges, right? So with number for Visa, number for MasterCard, for Diners Club. They also have one specific card range for UATP cards. And UATP is an association of airlines which designed, very similar to a card scheme, their own payment method, only for settling flights. And I think this is something where you see travel and credit cards, especially along the whole value chain, is, let's say, built in the foundations and therefore still is very rock solid. So if you use a card, it works. The moment you get into alternative payment methods, it gets a little bit bumpy and clunky. And so the virtual card, it sounded maybe just that I was laughing off a little bit about the opportunities that I see in travel. Indeed, it also helps that you maybe can, for example, do buy now, pay later now in a B2C portal, or you pay on direct settlement. And the actual channel transfers these kind of payments into a virtual card to allow having that supplier being paid out, but still have the custom experience on a payment method they would like to have. So I think the legacy of cards within travel, it's definitely obvious. And it's one of the working fallback mechanisms. And that's why I think the adoption of cards still is very high to that day. Also, if you look into travel management companies, especially in the corporate space, there's something called lodged cards. And it's not from lodging accommodation. It's from actually a lodged card is one big pen, one real card, sometimes without any limit. And it's stored for one client for a specific category or for the whole company. It's stored within the system of the travel management company. This is how they work with it. And you can imagine how interesting this is for fraud if anybody knows these lodged card numbers. There is no real control mechanism. There is no two-factor authentication on these things. And let's say this is where I see a high potential now with virtual cards being a successor for exactly these lodged card mechanisms. Because lodged cards were very simple solution to allow centralized and mid and back office operations just using one card number. But now with the facilitation of virtual cards, you can much easier have them being used throughout the old distribution and consumption layer, but also make sure that you have much more possibilities in order to have reduction on fraud, but also to have easy settlement with enriched data. I think this is some other innovations I see still being able now to be tapped inside travel.
And I think you want to mention a couple of other areas that you're seeing as being let's say, new financial service or embedded finance use case in travel. But maybe before doing that, what you described all of now, high level, I'm not sure if you have an answer to that question, but is most of the, let's say, financial service, payment, embedded finance use cases and travel on the B2B side, or is it more on, or is there also some like relevant exposure to B2C? Because everything you described right now, I mean, not everything, but quite a bit, I think let's say the money making, the interesting part is more on the B2B side and lesser on the actual consumer booking the travel side.
I think volume speaking, the B2B side always outplays the B2C side, because the adoption, once you have set up your supplier settlement on a certain payment method, all of your business is going through the same payment method. By that, you have much faster adoption of that functionality and this revenue channel. So I think they are more impactful, I would say. Not that they are more innovative or that they are more likely to happen. I think they just are outplaying the others in the absolute volume that is going through these rails. Definitely what's happening is there is a multitude of innovations also happening on the B2C side, but they are more in the mechanisms that you already are aware of, right? It's buy now, pay later, which is a huge topic. But it's also a big problem because travel usually is high risk. There's a lot of fraud happening, and buy now, pay later for a high risk product where sometimes you even don't know if this supplier will be still available for the travel, which is not even happened yet, right? If you buy something online, you receive it and your risk is off the books within the 5 days of receiving the goods and services, right? If you do this with travel, where somebody books his flight in 6 months, 3 months on average, this is a high risk and nobody really wants to bear that high risk. And also there's a certain cost of having these financial resources allocated for that specific product.
So is there,
so I think,
I remember a time a couple of years ago where there were a couple of like companies, maybe not popping up, but I came across some like describing them obviously very, very creative as fly now and pay later in these kind of schemes. So like, are you saying like they are not happening at all? Is it just not to the same extent that we're seeing in other industry? I mean, recording this right now, end of March, I think it was like last week, DoorDash announced the food delivery. So in a way, much smaller transaction size, but in a way, as you said, the product is being delivered immediately. And that at least that risk is taken out of the equation of this transaction.
Let's say, I think, without talking about the morals of trying to do these buy now, pay later stuff, where I see the US adoption is already completely different by using credit cards instead of Europe. I think with buy now, pay later, you only reach a certain target group which has the need for that cash flow optimization, right? Also, there's a lot of regulation in travel, especially when you go for tour operators like TUI, especially operating in Germany. They have to be very sensitive about the cash flow impacts on their own supply chain as well. So they can't always do everything that is possible in their own kind of operations. And so by that, I think certain functionalities like buy now, pay later, but there's also some interesting new solutions on split payments, for example. If you have a group travel, right, you want to book it for 5 friends, but you don't want to pay for 5 friends immediately, but you want to split it up for your 5 friends. There's some cool new functionalities coming who are built around such technology flexibility, but they always also are a little bit limited by the booking functionalities in the background, right?
Dependency of what we explained.
How long will the 5 friends take to pay their part? And when is the ticket confirmed, right? You don't have these issues if you have a pre-flight payment. Get it in the books, everybody's happy, and then some stuff like that is a known pattern and people got used to it. Even worse, the suppliers are stuck with it. They can't really handle themselves in very different behaviors and manners because their system is not designed, for example, to work asynchronously. They go through a checkout, they block a certain availability until the checkout is completed. They can't open this for everything, right? And I think this is where I would say the easiness in these B2B parts of the value chain of innovation is much faster to have a high adoption. They're not as innovative, but there is more volume going through. There is more adoption clearly mandated by building these things in than you have on the B2C stuff. And that's why I think it's always a little bit sad. There's plenty of things that I could think of that also would be much simpler, right? You could, for example, tokenize a ticket. And then even though you bought it, you could resell it, right? It's still the same seat. Maybe you don't have a cancellation policy, right? You can't cancel it, but then maybe I am allowed to resell it somewhere else because it's still this seat on the plane. I think there could be so many new opportunities to go forward, and we see there's some pilot projects for some vendors doing so.
Yeah.
But I think you need a whole industry to adopt a certain standard until you really can talk about innovation that made it ground.
I mean, do you see it happening though? I used to, or keep saying this, obviously, if you don't put a timeline towards your prediction, then it's always like very easy because at one point it will definitely happen. And if it takes, I don't know, hundreds of years, something like this, but let's say maybe more like in a 5, 10, 20 years time frame, when you would describe this, some of the features we described right now with like reselling, tokenizing the ticket and reselling it, I think everybody who looks high level at the process thinks, okay, that makes a lot of sense. But when you think further about it, you also realize like, okay, what's the benefit of actually the company need to implementing this? Means that the airline company or the travel company right now, in the way you can argue there's not much of a benefit because at the end of it, I mean, not sure, potentially they can make a cut out of each transaction and that way maybe even wants to support reselling at a later point of time. But again, it's probably, the question is like, how much does it cost me to build this and how much can I actually increase my revenues through this?
That's where I think we're back with politics, right? I think that there is clear management of certain functionalities. And that's why a lot of innovation is not making it through, even though it might be the better or the smarter. A name to look up in this regards is the Camino network. It's a blockchain-based settlement layer, which tries to enable Web3 throughout the travel industry. And they have built, I think, 400, 500 different projects with different suppliers on making use of blockchain. Shameful topic is that I'm not aware of one of these projects being adopted by more than just one supplier or being reused throughout the value chain multiple times, right? And I think this is where the power of certain Web3 solutions would be in, that you actually have this decentralized mechanism being available. And as long as you have certain aggregators, multiplicators, distribution players in game, you make it very complicated for a decentralized offering to come into play.
Of course.
Especially if you don't have the resources as the others get paid for every booking that's going through.
Of course.
Yeah, but I think it's good to see these first projects happening because they also allow to rethink business models, distribution models, and the value of services, especially with this flight example I made, right? With reselling your old ticket if you don't use it. There could be an argumental real market value for such functionality.
Of course.
And if we still think about certain ESG ideas where you want to make sure that every seat is best possibly used without just having an empty seat paid, things like that will help to also enlighten maybe not only the first economical good idea, but also the second one.
And looking at a bit of the time already, but like we touched on a couple of areas, right? We touched on, or you mentioned like virtual card for, let's say, the B2B payment side of a travel booking. We spoke about like buy now, pay later. Now a bit about Web3 and maybe potentially like reselling tickets. Is there any other, let's say, like hot topic or big area in terms of, let's say, fintech / payments / embedded finance happening in the travel industry that you think is like worthwhile highlighting, or are those the main areas?
I think the innovation within travel is more by combining the existing known patterns, right? If we talk about embedded finance and also talk about InsurTech, for example, clearly it comes with the idea of just combining the different dimensions that embedded finance brings and just make them available at the point of sale. Whether it's just saying payments of an alternative payment method, which comes without the insurance, being smart enough to upsell the insurance or make it already part of the product to make it even easier for the customer to change from a different known pattern towards the more cost-effective payment method. Stuff like that is where the airlines and hotels, of course, have a very clear eye view on. Something that I see also as a driver is frequent traveler programs. They allow the supplier to manage their clients and recurring clients, which is a very important and precious target group for them. And I see in the market already lots of different players trying to broaden the embedded finance around these frequent traveler programs. The classy example is the Miles & More credit card or Eurowings credit card or TUI credit card. Sometimes it's come with the classical perks you can think of, insurance, fast line, stuff like that, right? And in worst case, you have very smart users. They have all of these credit cards. So they know in Köln-Bonn, I use my Eurowings Gold, and in Frankfurt, I go with my Senator Miles & More card, right? And stuff like that, just for the sake of having some added perks within, or services within a certain supplier. And I think that now this will be opened up and get a little bit more flexible so that you can basically bundle these different functionalities in one profile. Or you have one large issuer of cards who's already providing you with a lot of these services with just one member fee. American Express, I think, is the best example. It's not sounding very new, but I think they just found a new way to sell what they were doing for the last 50 years, is to go much deeper into this offering and say, you have one American Express, but you have all of the perks with the different suppliers. You don't have to go to everyone individually. And the same we see with the airline programs opening up with different new cross functionalities. You can use your Miles & More now with Sixt and stuff like that. I think this is where it gets really intense. And then the financial, the insurance, but also all of these settlement, accounting topics, especially when you look into business travel. The fintech world gets even more deep there when you go into accounting and expense tools. I think this is where they are now broadened up and understanding that they can tap into this much larger space by being more individual, more.
Eric, I mean, we have seen that you know a lot about the industry. I think I can also sense maybe at least a bit of a passion for what's happening there, even though it might not always be very easy either. I mean, it might be quite interesting to understand, like, where does your knowledge come from? Like, what's your personal, or maybe with the company, the exposure to the travel industry, and what are you currently building?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a frequent traveler, so a lot of that passion of traveling comes from myself. But no, I think from a professional side, in 2014, I founded an online travel agency for apartments, serviced apartments especially, where we founded AKA Modio for brokering apartments into corporates as an alternative for Airbnb for business. We created AKA Modio to have a professional subset of suppliers, catering everything from 7 nights on. We were very deeply connected into more than 40 multinational corporates where we were supplying them with apartments all over the world. And that's where we learned the hard way how this value chain works and how a new product needs to bypass certain mechanism or include certain legacy to be able to actually fulfill the output that you are selling to the client, because that's the easy part. It's more the complexity in the background, how to orchestrate it, what you have to be integrated, which payment systems or reporting layers you have to be included. And then also recently, after I sold AKA Modio in 2021, 2 years ago, I've founded Click Procurement, which is basically the idea of putting the learnings that we had with AKA Modio, how to integrate deeper into corporates, to make this productize it and allow to bring the B2C convenience that you know from PayPal to throw that at every vendor. So basically, we're starting again in the business travel space where we see this is quite complexity that we were able to already play through and allow corporates to buy travel on any merchant, but also to allow merchants to untap the corporate demand space, because this usually is not very compatible.
Understood. And obviously, I'll put the links to your profile in the company, the show notes. So if there's somebody out there who wants to maybe either learn a bit more about what you're building today, or maybe even perhaps wants to have a chat with you about your experience in the past in the travel industry, I guess that would be a suitable way to reach you.
Thank you very much for the time. And if there's anyone having questions, my LinkedIn is always open and available.
We'll link that for sure as well. So thanks, Eric, for joining. I personally learned quite a bit. I think, I mean, we recorded now even a bit longer than the usual episode. I still don't feel like there's so much more, I think, the whole industry, but maybe we'll come to that another time. So thanks, Eric, for joining. And until next time. Thank you for listening. For more episodes and our weekly newsletter, please visit embeddedfinancereview.com. And please reach out if you have an interesting embedded finance story to tell. Until next time.